Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Soo Kim. South Korea's presidential election is just a few days away on March 9th. The incoming president, whoever it turns out to be, will play a critical role steering South Korea's course for the next 5 years, especially in the country's relationship with its ally, the United States, as well as with its neighboring North Korea. As we count down to the presidential election, North Korea has recently fired another ballistic missile into the sea. Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Bruce Klingner, Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation's Asia Studies Center. Mr. Klingner served as CIA's Deputy Division Chief for Korea. Soo Kim is also with me today. She is Policy Analyst at RAND Corporation. Ms. Kim also served at the Central Intelligence Agency as an analyst. Welcome to the show. Good to have you both today.
Oh, thanks for having us.
The South Korean presidential election is just around the corner. It is watched closely here in Washington too, I assume. Mr. Klingner, what is the significance of this upcoming election in South Korea?
It's very important because it'll determine the foreign and security policies of a critically important ally to the United States. So while the election itself will likely turn on domestic issues or economic issues, the main focus here in Washington is on which path the new South Korean president takes on security policies and foreign policies, particularly to North Korea, China, and Japan.
Ms. Kim, why is this election important for the U.S. policymakers?
Looking back, upon the past 5 years, Washington might be looking for an opportunity to basically regain some of the momentum and the progress it had lost between the Moon and the Trump administration. So again, it's a way for the two countries to reset and recalibrate their relationship. I think also at the most basic level, it's also about potential chemistry between the leaders. So even if, let's say, there were some minor shifts or divergences in the policy positions, there could be an opportunity for the two countries to mend fences and to build upon their relationship if the two leaders were to be able to get along on a person-to-person level as well.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the new president's North Korean policy is directly linked to the security and stability in the Korean Peninsula. North Korea had been shunning incumbent President Moon Jae-in's continuous attempt to engage. Now, the two major presidential candidates, Lee Jae-myung and Yoon Suk-yeol, they have very different approaches toward North Korea. Ms. Kim, how would you compare their policies?
So I think that either the Lee or the Yoon administration, we're both looking at what we would call, I think, a conventional approach in that if we were to have a Lee administration, it's conventional in the sense that we'll basically see a Moon Jae-in policy on North Korea redux. So that means more engagement vis-a-vis North Korea. Lee also said that he would be willing to consider resuming the Mount Kumgang tours, which of course is going to question whether or not this would be complying with UN regulations. He also mentioned, just like Moon Jae-in, that he wants South Korea to be the driver in the policy towards North Korea. So we're not really expecting much of a different turn from what we've seen from Moon Jae-in. On the flip side, with the Yoon administration, we're going to see conventional in the sense that it will be basically what the South Korean conservative position has been vis-a-vis North Korea, vis-a-vis China, and vis-a-vis the United States. So I think in this sense, it might be easier for the Biden administration to try to build relations with the Yoon administration, simply because there won't be much of a difference or a dramatic change from what we were expecting from the South Koreans as an ally.
Well, I agree with all those points. It would be either a continuation of Moon Jae-in policy or a return to sort of traditional conservative policy. With Mr. Lee, we see a continued emphasis on end-of-war declaration, a premature OPCON transition, a soft approach to North Korea based on the idea of change through trade, advocating a long list of economic benefits and other benefits to North Korea. All the economic benefits would violate UN resolutions or US law, as well as a more accommodating approach to China, and I think a continuation of tensions with Japan. Mr. Yoon would be more pro-alliance, more in favor of enforcing UN resolutions and international law, a willingness to have diplomacy with North Korea, but a requirement for North Korea, who's the one in violation of resolutions, to make movement towards compliance in order to receive benefits. And perhaps a better, though still strained, relationship with Japan. I think there's a better chance of improved bilateral relations, and in that way, more trilateral cooperation with the U.S. towards the threats of this millennium rather than focusing on the threats of the last millennium.
Mr. Klingner, will North Korea refrain from provocations if someone they prefer gets elected?
No. Regardless of who's elected, North Korea will continue to do provocations when it suits their objectives. And provocations is sort of an all-encompassing term that we use, which really covers a range of actions by North Korea, from acts of war, acts of terror, violations of law and resolutions, threats, and also development of missiles and increasing the military threat to South Korea, Japan, and the United States. So it's an all-encompassing, sort of unsatisfying phrase. And all of these North Korean actions also have different objectives. Some are internal to prop up the regime's stature with the people. Others are simply improving and continuing its military capabilities. And then some are signals to Washington. But North Korea will continue to do all of these actions. It's just a matter of when.
I think whether it's a conservative or progressive administration, it's just going to find a way to justify its actions. So, it's any action that the South Koreans take is just going to be fodder or justification for Kim Jong-un to continue to build and also to provoke. So let's say that we have a conservative administration under you. It's going to be a typical North Korean response where they blame the United States, or South Korea, the hostile policies, and it's this way Kim Jong-un would be able to decry any sort of defense and weapons development in Seoul, and use that, I think, to further expand the suite of missile and nuclear capabilities. If we have a progressive administration, North Korea is just going to use Seoul as basically a pushover to push forward with its plans, again, with the weapons development and provocations, under the banner, I would say, of engagement and reconciliation. It's just going to give Kim Jong-un more time to get stronger and become even more emboldened for Washington and Seoul to have to deal with. And it's just going to be a bigger problem, I think, for us to manage.
Ms. Kim, you said earlier that Mr. Yoon Suk-yeol's policy might be closer to what Washington pursues with its North Korean policy. Is that correct?
I would say so. I think at first blush, that's what we're going to expect, because if we're looking at a typical South Korean conservative administration, they're probably going to place security as their top policy issue. And with that, I think, is going to come prioritization of the alliance. And that, in turn, is going to set the pace and, I think, the direction of how the two countries are going to be dealing with the North Korea problem. But I would also say that with the, if we were to see a Lee administration, that's not necessarily going to mean that they're going to do a complete about-face vis-a-vis the alliance. It's going to take time, I think, for the Lee administration to actually make progress on their policies. I also think that it might be an opportunity for the United States to, show incentives or gently remind the South Koreans the value of the alliance, as well as the responsibilities that come with, I think, the partnership and South Korea's status as a leading country economically and politically.
Mr. Klingner, can you also pinpoint who would be easier for the U.S. government to cooperate with?
I think it'd be very much easier for the U.S. to cooperate with Mr. Yoon than Mr. Lee. Mr. Yoon would be very pro-alliance, and it tends to be conservatives are more skeptical of North Korea than the United States. Progressives in South Korea tend to be more skeptical of the U.S. than North Korea. So Mr. Yoon would highly focus on improving, maintaining the relationship with Washington. And I think the Biden administration's very quick resolution of the special measures agreement negotiations last year, where we abandoned Trump's attempts to make money off of the stationing of our sons and daughters in uniform overseas and instead accept an incremental increase. That was the right step to do by the Biden administration. That removed a major irritant between Washington and Seoul. So relations are good. It's just that there are more differences between a Biden administration and a progressive government in Seoul than with a conservative government.
Mr. Klingner, it's been more than a year since U.S. President Joe Biden came into office. President Biden had talks with South Korean President Moon quite a few times, and the Moon administration had pushed to ease sanctions on North Korea, but the Biden administration maintains the stance that no sanctions should be relieved unless there's a tangible progress toward denuclearization. And about the end of war declaration, it was also strongly pushed by President Moon, but the Biden administration didn't seem to be too enthusiastic. Mr. Klingner, did they expose some difference of opinions here?
Very much so. It was not only a case of the Moon administration advocating for an end of war declaration, but repeatedly claiming that the U.S. was fully on board, that it embraced this idea, and that we were on the cusp of releasing agreed upon text. And that was not the case. Behind the scenes, U.S. diplomats and senior officials were saying that this is not the case, but we're trying not to expose differences with our critically important ally. But when President Moon and other senior officials kept repeatedly saying that we were on the cusp of releasing the text, that's when National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and others felt they sort of had to go out there and as politely as they could sort of say there are differences here, but we don't want to highlight them. So sort of saying like, well, we're on the same page, but the paragraphs are in a different order. But that message was not taken up by Seoul, and they continue to claim that we're about to do this end of war declaration, and the U.S. doesn't want to do that. They see it as a bad idea. It's meaningless, as South Korean officials have pointed out, but it's done in the hopes that it'll bring North Korea back to the table.
Ms. Kim, did you also sense that the two sides were not seeing eye to eye?
I think that was quite apparent. I also think that on sanctions and the end of war declaration, it's basically like a litmus test to assess where the two countries are with respect to North Korea. And it also shows, I think, how solid the alliance is. And with one country going, diverging from the path that we've normally taken, it's problematic. And I think it also raised eyebrows as to where the commitment was on the part of the Moon administration. The fact that they were able to he was able to pursue inter-Korean engagement with such fervor and enthusiasm. It also came with a price, not just with respect to the alliance, but on matters that were also very important to the region, which includes how the region responds to China's aggression, democracy, human rights, and so forth. So it had compounding effects. And I'm hoping that whoever becomes the next president is aware that this has not just a Korea implication, but a regional implication as well.
Ms. Kim, so was the Biden administration waiting for the new South Korean president so that they'll be clear about South Korea's long-term policy?
I don't think they're going to be waiting to change their position. I think the United States position on North Korea, on regional threats, has been pretty consistent with respect to our values. But I do think that there might be some recalibration, I would say, minor adjustments that come with having to deal with the intricacies and the different personalities in a new leadership. So I think what the current administration is expecting is that perhaps this will be a breath of fresh air where the two countries will be able to finally, once again, work on common challenges and also look forward to threats that are not just confined to regional divides and functional areas.
So, Mr. Klingner, this wasn't about the Biden administration waiting for the incoming South Korea's new president, was it?
Right. Well, there are enduring objectives that transcend U.S. administrations and South Korean administrations. And looking at the broader picture of the region, the U.S. has long been frustrated with South Korea's unwillingness to really take a stand and advocate for upholding common values that democracies share of freedom and democracy, rule of law, human rights. Long before the Moon administration, the U.S. was simply trying to get South Korea to criticize China's actions in the South China Sea, let alone do any freedom of navigation operations or anything. And we've seen that a continuation under the Moon administration of trying to stand on the sidelines or fly under the radar of not criticizing China by name about its human rights violations, of its actions in the East and the South China Sea, and intimidation of Taiwan. And if you compare the joint statement following the Biden Japanese Prime Minister Suga visit with the Moon Biden summit, you can see where South Korea is willing to criticize Chinese actions after some urging, but not mention that they were done by China, whereas Japan was willing to do that. And we're seeing that play out also in the reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where Japan was very quickly on board with strong measures against Russia, whereas South Korea was more muted and delayed and seemingly having to be shamed into standing up for some of these international responses to Russia, and yet apparently at the same time asking for exemptions from sanctions because it would hurt South Korea's economy. So that's very disappointing for a democracy to take that kind of stand.
Mr. Klingner, so overall, the cooperation between the U.S. and South Korea is most important. What are the key issues now that need to be closely really sorted out and coordinated between the two countries?
Well, there's quite a range. On alliance issues, I think the alliance is in a very strong position. I think the relationship is very good. We have some differences on military issues of OPCON transition, the conditions that need to be fulfilled. We have differences on North Korea policy of end-of-war declaration, prematurely relaxing sanctions, et cetera, that I think would be less so under Mr. Yoon's administration. But also we have to improve relations between Seoul and Tokyo. We need to have not only the bilateral cooperation, but the trilateral cooperation against both the North Korean and the Chinese threats. And we also are looking for South Korea to take a bigger role on the world stage, more commensurate with what Japan has been doing in recent years of joining the Quad and more firmly standing up to Chinese transgression. So South Korea often seems to want to have the benefits of being a strong mid-level power, but not wanting to assume the responsibility. So that will be an area that I think will still be a challenge, regardless of whether it's Mr. Lee or Mr. Yoon, because South Korea sort of has typically sought to not play a strong role pushing back against authoritarian regimes.
I also think that the whole idea about South Korea wanting to reap the benefits of its status while not really playing up to the field, I think it's exactly right. I think that along with its status as the 10th or the 12th largest economy in the world, it's looked to as a model for liberal democratic societies. There's a responsibility that comes with it, and you need to be able to match the heft with your own heft, and we haven't really seen that in the recent several years. So the aspiration, I think, hopefully, from the United States, and also I would hope from the South Korean people, is that the next administration is going to, again, try to make some leaps and bounds, to make up for the stagnation or the idleness that we've seen from the Moon administration, and really look to not just repair the alliance and the old values, but also look forward to, as we've seen with the pandemic, with the ongoing Russia-Ukraine crisis. It's not just about my own country's national interest, but how can we better serve as responsible participants of the international community. And I think that should be the message that reverberates within the new South Korean government, but also within South Korean society.
And there's one specific area that many watchers, many experts and activists call for the cooperation between the U.S. and South Korea, and that's the human rights issue in North Korea. What do you expect to see in this area when the new South Korean administration comes in, Ms. Kim first?
Well, I think it depends on who becomes president. I think under a unit administration, we're probably going to see, again, a resetting And hopefully South Korea's, again, active voice, because it not only just shares a border with North Korea, but it has a responsibility to call attention to the rights of the North Korean population. And also, it's also related to the North Korean nuclear weapons program. I think the more the North Korean people's voices are muted, the more incentive and I think the more empowerment Kim Jong-un is going to feel. With respect to the Lee administration, I'm a little bit skeptical that he's going to want to take a vocal approach. We might see him tagging along, if and when it's necessary for South Korea to finally make that call. But I don't really see, a progressive, a repeat of the Moon administration being at the forefront of calling out the Kim regime's violation of human rights and just, grave crimes against humanity.
Mr. Klingner, do you agree that this human rights issue in North Korea is an important issue to be dealt with?
Very much so. And unfortunately, under progressive governments in South Korea, there's been a tendency to overlook or turn a blind eye to North Korean human rights violations, which the UN Commission of Inquiry deemed to be crimes against humanity because they were so widespread and systemic by the regime. So, we have to stand up for human rights. It's part of not only American values, but also South Korean values. And as South Korea celebrated Samil to honor those who stood up against an authoritarian regime, despite the cost to their own freedom and lives. South Korea also has to look towards the North Korean people who are suffering, as well as those who are suffering in China, the Uyghur minority and Hong Kong, and also now in Ukraine, where a smaller country is fighting back against a large, aggressive authoritarian government. So that the spirit of Samil, I think, is something that has to be honored not only within South Korea, but as we look at nations or peoples fighting back against oppression. So I hope the next South Korean administration will implement that as part of their overall policy, not just to North Korea.
And now North Korea is continuing on with its provocations. Just right after the Beijing Olympics ended and before the Paralympics starts, North Korea fired a missile, what it claims to be a test for reconnaissance satellite. And many watchers were skeptical about that. What should we be prepared to see from North Korea after the presidential election? Mr. Klingner.
Well, regardless of who's elected in South Korea, North Korea will continue to, expand and refine its missile arsenal of all ranges. And the question now is, will they resume either ICBM or satellite launch tests or another nuclear test? And it's just a matter of time, really. But people have often been very skeptical of North Korea's accomplishments or ability to do things. At first, it was denying they had a nuclear program or a second nuclear program with uranium, or the capabilities of its missiles, saying the missiles always fail until they didn't, or that they could have a missile that could reach the entire continental United States, which they do, and even their cyber capabilities, cyber attack capabilities. So if people are saying, well, we don't think they can really have a electro-optical reconnaissance satellite, it's like, well, just wait for it. They're probably going to do it. So this latest missile, because it sent back photos taken from the missile, likely was a precursor to a reconnaissance satellite launch, which, if they do it, that launch over Japan to a long range into the Pacific, regardless of whether they say it's civilian and not military, it's going to be highly provocative and maybe a precursor to an ICBM launch, which would be even more provocative.
Ms. Kim, how will North Korea set the pace for their provocations this year?
It's just going to be, the timing and the pace is going to be how Kim Jong-un determines it. I think some of these world events are going to shape the way or the timing of the provocations, but by and large, it's just going to be in the hands of Kim Jong-un. And what I am concerned about is that every provocation seems to merit a response. Of course, we should be concerned about the developments, but I also think that sometimes the responses also need to be commensurate to the threat. And we also need to respond in a way that sends Kim Jong-un the message that he should not be doing this and that there will be consequences. And I don't think we've seen or we've demonstrated enough to him that there will be consequences so grave that he will stop.
My last question for today. Ms. Kim, amid all this, will North Korea come back to talks?
Well, I think on the topic of talks, I think if North Korea does decide to come back, we should not be so hopeful, but I think we should actually be concerned about what potential incentives or accommodations would North Korea want the United States, South Korea, and other parties to make in exchange for some partial gestures that might be reversed by the Kim regime. I think the end result of this game is that Kim will just pocket the gains while he gets to retain his nuclear weapons and his missile program.
I'd say whether North Korea does a provocation or returns to talks, I think the answer to both is yes. It's just we don't know the time frame. So if you put the time frame out long enough, yes, they likely will come back to some level of talks, just as they're likely to do a provocation. But it's what are the circumstances and what are the motivations and what are their objectives? So, some will argue that we need to offer concessions, including relaxation of enforcement of laws, in order to induce them back to talks. No, talks don't have a very good history of success. So, when people kind of put it into a false paradigm of sanctions or diplomacy, we need both. But as people say, sanctions don't work. Well, diplomacy didn't work either. But that's not to say we don't keep trying with diplomacy. But in the meantime, we need to maintain our military deterrence, as well as maintaining enforcing of laws and resolutions until the actions which triggered them or promises to stop doing those actions, have been implemented.
Both of the two major candidates for new South Korean president emphasized the importance of the alliance between the US and South Korea. However, how each of them approaches the diplomatic affairs appears to be very different. And now, not only the South Korean voters, but also the Americans are eager to see how the presidential election in South Korea turns out. Mr. Klingner and Ms. Kim, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.